All right, listeners, Marco and I usually have the luxury of relaxing for a 2-hour conversation, but we've got a tight 57 minutes because I've got to run. So we are going to absolutely blow your minds. There's no time for foreplay. There's no time for jokes. There's no time for basketball, even though the Knicks are up 2-0. Oh my God, we've got to get straight into it. I will integrate Jason Tatum metaphors throughout this though, because you might remember, Marco, last year on a podcast with you, I said there was no chance that Jason Tatum was good enough to lead a team to the NBA championship. I think in retrospect, that was the correct call. It's just everybody else was so shitty. Anyway, we're not supposed to do that. So anyway, why don't we start here? There's been a lot of weird stuff in the Middle East the past couple of days. Kind of started with actually something you sent me with RFK Jr. and Nancy Pelosi both raging at King Abdullah II of Jordan, also Star Trek's most famous extra, made an appearance in Star Trek Voyager for you Star Trek nerds out there. And apparently the issue is that King Abdullah said that he would accept 2,000 children from Gaza who had cancer and other illnesses. He's only taken in 44. Now he's slow playing it. And Jordan says that the king is slow playing it because he's not sure they're going to be able to return to Gaza. I don't know who would want to return to Gaza. There's nothing left of it, but we can get into that later. And Kennedy and Pelosi are taking this as a personal affront and a betrayal. We can get into that later. Then earlier this week, the Houthis struck Israel with a missile. This was not your garden variety missile. It got past missile defense. It made a huge crater near the Tel Aviv airport, shut down flights in and out of Israel for a while, so it got the Israelis' attention. Israel went back and hit them. In the meantime, apparently Donald Trump had a call with the Houthis and agreed that the United States would stop bombing them as long as the Houthis stopped bombing shipping, to which the Houthis, and I mean, we have to take this, at face value from the source, but according to Mr. Trump, the Houthis said, cool, we're just going to keep bombing Israel. And Trump was cool with that. There was no objection from the United States that the Houthis were going to keep on with Israel as long as they stopped bombing ships. Some of the quotes here about the Houthis are also incredible. Trump saying that he had a good outcome. They had a great capacity to withstand punishment. Quote, you could say there's a lot of bravery there. It's amazing what they took, end quote. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has come out and said, fine, the Israelis will defend themselves alone against the Houthis if they must, if the United States is not on their side. And then amidst all of this, Israel also in the last week or two has been talking about basically just annexing the Gaza Strip. There have also been rumors and various reports that the United States has agreed to administer the region on a temporary basis until the Israelis or some other group of countries or whatever else can take it over. Like there's a lot that is unclear here. And in the background, Iran and the United States continue to have negotiations, and Marco Papich has been running around the Middle East, briefing clients and learning things from the ground up. Marco, where should we start?
Well, I mean, I thought that was, I think one of the interesting things that Trump does is that he actually gives props to, America's rivals. And it's very old school. It's medieval, and I think that this isn't the first time he's done it. He actually did that to Iran after the killing of General Soleimani. Iran retaliated, and President Trump said, okay, I respect that. I consider this matter over. Actually, Vice President Harris, brought that up in the debates, if you remember, and she actually accused him of being callous and glib about American servicemen being, put in harm's way. I think it's appropriate given that the world is multipolar and you can't enforce some sort of a unipolar normative hegemony. So you've got to, recognize the reality. But what's interesting to me is just how quickly apparently the deal was struck between the US and the Houthis. And what's not clear to me, but I lean towards the view that President Trump and the Houthis actually agreed that they would not target American vessels and American shipping. It didn't seem to me like the Houthis said that they would stop targeting all shipping. But, I guess that's yet to be confirmed or, seen in reality. So it does seem to me like the U.S. is, effectively just pursuing its own interests. And I think that most countries in the Middle East already knew that. In fact, one of the interesting things that I did find out while I was in Saudi Arabia was that for many Saudis, it was really after various drones attacked their infrastructure, energy infrastructure, that Saudi Arabia took seriously this idea that Americans wouldn't be there to actually prevent any conflict with Iran. And therefore, they went ahead and made their own detente. I don't want to call it a peace deal because it's not. Iran and Saudi Arabia are always going to be rivals, and they're always going to look at each other askew. But it was interesting that was the narrative that was very prevalent in Saudi Arabia. It was like an obvious thing. Like, yes, I mean, once we realized that Iran can strike inside Saudi Arabia, relatively with little costs from the American perspective, we decided to make our own deal with them.
You were right. So President Trump himself, here's the quote from him. They said, please don't bomb us anymore, and we're not going to attack your ships, end quote. But then most of the media is covering it as the Houthis agreeing to stop interrupting important shipping lanes. So I don't know how we got to that leap sort of in the media there. I'm also fairly certain that the Houthis did not call President Trump and say, please don't bomb us, but that's neither here nor there. Well, let me cook on Israel for a second for all three of our Israeli listeners. And yes, I'm going to do that. The thing I hate the most in the world, a guy with the last name Shapiro is going to tell you about Israeli geopolitics. And
the guy with the name Papic is just going to sidestep that landmine elegantly and let you fall right on it.
I jump on it. Oh, by the way, though, I mean, in our last podcast, Marco, it was the Jew who read the Vatican correctly. You thought the next pope was coming from Asia. I said, no, I think he's coming from somewhere more traditional.
You nailed it.
The Jew won, nihilist zero. But here, I'm probably going to give up the victory right here.
Oof. Yes. Well, you know what? That's just going to launch a steady stream of new conspiracies that Jews also run the Vatican.
That's a conspiracy? Conspiracy implies lack of truth. I'm going to get in trouble. So when it comes to Israel, though, I think Benjamin Netanyahu is an incredible domestic politician, and he has survived for as long as he has by creating this Iranian boogeyman. And I think long-term in Israel's grand strategy, it's the exact wrong thing to do, because the long-term threat to Israel is not from Iran, from a Shiite Persian country that is many thousands of miles or however much it is away from Israel. It's from local Sunni Arabs and from Turkey. And those forces have been sort of gaining in power, gaining in wealth around Israel, even as some of them, like the Saudis, are batting their eyelashes at it. And Netanyahu continues to hammer on the Houthis. The other thing that Netanyahu did was he completely tripled down in his relationship with Donald Trump. Thought that Donald Trump was going to look out for Israeli interests, thought that he had the measure of the man. And that was a miscalculation. He didn't have the measure of the man. And I have been saying for years that the United States would jettison Israeli interests just as soon as it was in U.S. interest to do so. And that would have been Biden, it would have been Harris, it would have been Trump, it would have been anybody. There was nobody who was going to have that ironclad commitment with Israel. And I don't care that Jared Kushner's in the background. Like, it's just not going to work. And Israel long term, if it's thinking about its future, it really needs to start thinking about a world in which it doesn't have sort of unqualified U.S. support. It needs to think about threats that are much closer to home, whether that's Turkey and its navy in its backyard, or going after their natural gas interests, or the breaking up of treaties with Egypt and Jordan, or a real insurgency in the West Bank, because the Palestinians realize they have nothing left to lose. Like, it's a very difficult position that Israel has put itself in. And I think from just a grand strategy point of view, its short-term politics is affecting Israel's long-term strategic interests. And this should be a big warning sign to Israeli strategic decision makers, security officials. They probably won't listen to it because they're all obsessed with the Iranian nuclear weapon. And I get it. I get why you're obsessed with that. But there are much bigger fish to fry closer to home. And I don't think anything's going to change. And that's just the way that it is. And end rant.
No, I mean, I wish there was something to disagree with you on, but I think you're 100%. I don't know whether I said it on the podcast or whether I said it to my clients in meetings, but I think that it's incredibly naive to triple down on Donald Trump. So he moved the embassy to Jerusalem. Whoop-de-doo. Okay, that means nothing. I would disagree with one thing. I think it would be very difficult for Joe Biden or Vice President Harris to turn on Israel. I think that they would have been accused immediately by the Republicans of being weak. Donald Trump can do it in a second. And by the way, Donald Trump can pretty much do anything he wants. And there's very little criticism he will receive from, I would argue, a majority of Americans. And so this is a big one. This is where I think, President Trump has a mix, I think, of pretty solid instinct on U.S. interest at times, particularly tactically, maybe long term, no, but tactically, yes. And second of all, Donald Trump's interests are what's good for Donald Trump, and continued conflict in the Middle East is not. He has branded himself very powerfully. This is an important part of his brand as someone who can get deals done and, more importantly, create geopolitical equilibrium around the world. And I think Israel is making a very big mistake by continuing the Gaza operation. And I don't mean that from an operational perspective or tactical perspective of like, let's find hostages and destroy Hamas. That's all fine and good, and Israel can do whatever they want. I understand that. But it's more from a perspective of like, is that aligned with President Trump's interests? And they should probably fall in that line if they want to continue to receive his support. And I think this Houthi deal is a great example of that. I mean, like the Houthis attacked Tel Aviv airport either right after the deal was struck or while President Trump was, phoning the Houthis. And there's been like no comment from the United States on that. And that should be that should send very cold sweat down the spine of anyone in Netanyahu's government.
Yeah. What about King Abdullah and Jordan and RFK Jr.? I'll let you cook on that.
Well, no, I mean that's also aligned with your view, which is, I mean, again, maybe where I would disagree with you is a little bit on Turkey. I don't see why. I think Turkey has interests and designs on Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, but I also don't think that Turkey in any way, shape, or form has ever, considered or thought or even fantasized or dreamed or had a nightmare about Israel not having the right to exist. So that's where I think I disagree with you. I think Turkey and Israel can coexist. They can be rivals. They can be even enemies, but it's not an existential risk. I don't see why Turkey would have that kind of a, confrontation with Israel.
Well, maybe it's not an existential risk, and maybe that's like the outlier scenario, but it is certainly a geopolitical imperative for Turkey. Once it has to have control of the Levant first, and of Iraq and all, and it has to subdue any threat from Persia or whatever. But eventually, the Neo-Ottomans have to have what is today Israel. Like Ottoman Palestine was taken, like it wasn't a Palestinian state that the Jews took Ottoman Palestine from. It was the Ottoman Empire that they inserted themselves, and then the British Empire that held it afterwards. And if you have imperial ambitions in the region, that the area that is Israel or Palestine or whatever you want to call it based on your politics has always been important for those types of regional powers that are thinking about connecting Middle East, Eurasia, all these other things. So
I think it's tough. I think it's tough for them to repeat. I don't think water will flow down the same channels, 200 years later. But it's okay. We can disagree on that. I mean, ultimately, it doesn't. To me, that's like step 2, step 3, and we can debate it at some other time. But to me, I would say the biggest threat is collapse of states that have treaties. You framed it like Egypt and Jordan one day decide they don't want to tear up the treaties that they have with Israel. And I would say that could happen because those states collapse due to Israeli actions. Now, that's less likely to happen with Egypt because it's such a large country, and an influx of Palestinian refugees into Egypt, I think, is relatively manageable, and it's it's basically run by the military and so on and so on. But what's happening in Jordan is, I think, very concerning. And this is where the West can really be callous. Like if we had a TikTok camera, I would ask for you to like shine it on me, because here's a country that's done nothing but like right by the West, by its allies. It's stable monarchy. King Abdullah is doing the best job he can do. It's a country where Palestinians, either descendants of refugees or refugees themselves, form a very large majority. It's a country where the PLO, at one time in its sort of rambunctious youth, when they had their hair down and they were smoking cigarettes and running around hijacking planes, tried to overtake King Abdullah's father, in 1971, where the United States effectively had to bring in the Pakistanis to save the Hashemite kingdom. So this is a country with a history of problems between the monarchy and the Palestinians. I think King Abdullah has really worked on fixing that. He is married to a very eloquent, very I think, well-spoken Palestinian himself. So he's tried to create this kind of syncretic culture, but that makes it more difficult for him to ignore what's going on. And over the past, 18 months, I would say that the change in tone from the monarchy of Jordan is probably the most severe when it comes to Israel out of any country in the world. People talk about Europeans not sending weapons to Israel anymore. Like that's neither here nor there. The real change in attitude and tone is from Jordan. And I think King Abdullah is basically telling the world, like, hey guys, like I can't hold back the dam any longer. And if Israel annexes Gaza, I think that's, perhaps neither here nor there. But I think the biggest problem is what happens to the Palestinians, the West Bank. And if they start coming across the border to Jordan, I think that Israeli threat perception is going to diametrically change. Israel has not had to guard its eastern borders, which are massive. It hasn't had to deal with them in over, 30 years. It hasn't had to really worry about them at all. And so I think that this is an existential risk to Israel. I believe that the preservation of the Hashemite monarchy dynasty in Amman is more important to, honestly, Israeli continued existence than, anything in the world. And yet they're treating it so callously because you're completely right. Benjamin Netanyahu is perhaps one of the greatest domestic politicians in the world. But I think that he has absolutely no interest in what happens to his own country 24 months after today.
Can't argue there. All right, let's move on from that because
I know we're short on time, but I just want to say Nancy Pelosi and RFK, what the hell do they even know about this region? I mean, they are blaming King Abdullah. This is the hypocrisy that I'm like, 2,000 children in Amman hospitals, the third richest country on the planet, has the gall to criticize Jordan for not taking 2,000 sick kids from Gaza. What? There's no space in American hospitals? Like, are you kidding me? This is a country of like 12 million people. It is shocking that they would publicly voice this. And anyone who's watching this and hates Trump and the Republicans or hates Democrats and Joe Biden, please, for the love of God, realize they're kind of all morons. That Nancy Pelosi and RFK can be on the same page, and that page is, quite frankly, it's embarrassing for the United States of America to be putting that kind of pressure on a country that's trying to balance incredibly difficult politics and geopolitics. So, God bless Jordan. Obviously, I'm biased. I spent 4 years of my life there as a kid, and I think it's an awesome country. And I think that they're doing the best in a very, very difficult region to balance all sorts of different, very difficult landmines. So I think it's embarrassing what Nancy Pelosi and RFK said. They're basically accusing, King Abdullah of reneging on his promise to bring sick children into Amman, but it's not that simple, And if they understood that, they would just, swallow the bullet and say, you know what, United States of America will take them because it's become a very difficult thing for King Abdullah to act on.
Yeah, it's tone deaf. And I also appreciate Jordan just from an intellectual perspective, because on paper, if you just look at all the things that make up Jordan and all the challenges they've had, that country should not exist geopolitically. It doesn't make sense. The fact that the Hashemites have held on as long as they have doesn't make any sense. It's actually a nice slice of humble pie for geopolitical analysts, because everything that I know about geopolitics tells me that Jordan should have collapsed during the Arab Spring. And the fact that they're still alive and kicking after taking all the Syrian refugees, after everything with the Palestinians, after ISIS on its borders with Iraq, Saudi.
Let me go further. Can I interrupt you and go further?
Please.
That country may very well, in some sort of parallel universe, be a bastion of terrorism, right? I mean, you have all these refugees from all these conflicts, vast majority of them with a bone to pick with Israel. And yet, it's been nothing but an absolute oasis of stability. And there's many reasons for that. I think that obviously the Hashemite monarchy has done a great job and King Abdullah has followed in the footsteps of his dad. But I would also say that it has to do a lot with the Bedouin culture that they've adopted, the ability to sort of, listen to everyone, try to take a cold shower before making any big decisions. So there's a lot of reasons for that. And obviously the support of the United States has helped, support of Saudi Arabia as well at times, although King Hussein kind of made some mistakes, specifically with supporting Saddam a little bit during the first Gulf War. But the point that I'm making is you're absolutely right, and it could be even worse. Not just not exist. Israel cannot ask for honestly a better neighbor. And yet the actions of Israelis are in the long term imperiling that. So if you are pro-Israeli, if you care about Israel and its existence in the long term, cast your eye across the River Jordan and take a moment to consider what would happen if Jordan, destabilized. What's going to happen then? Israel's going to take the East Bank? I mean, yeah. So anyways, that's our rant for today.
Yeah. I'm sure there are Zionist zealots who think that, but yeah, let's not get too far down the rabbit hole.
Now we have to do our first commercial read. This podcast is sponsored by Royal Jordanian. Visit Jordan. I'm just kidding. It's not at all. But if anybody from Royal Jordanian would like to talk about that, please email the podcast. We would love to talk to you. Flights to New York from Amman 3 times a week. I actually have no idea.
It's from what I understand from friends who it might be the worst airline in.
Come on.
One of the worst.
You have clearly not flown sub-Saharan airlines.
Yeah, I was just going to say, which is a great segue to the second thing I wanted to talk about. I know you want to talk about social media and branding, but you were the one who sent me that you've been getting pro-Ibrahim Traore, I don't think I'm pronouncing that correctly, videos on your YouTube algorithm. This is the leader, dictator, president, general, whatever he wants to call himself, of Burkina Faso. Probably most of our listeners, I don't know, we have a lot of nerds here, but so Burkina Faso, landlocked country in Africa, borders on places like Mali to the north, Ghana to the south, doesn't quite touch Nigeria, has some Niger that's in there. Also to the south is Ivory Coast. It's about, in terms of population, the size of Florida, so landlocked Florida in the middle of Africa. Over 40% of the population below the poverty line. Agriculture is the primary sector. It employs 80% of the workforce, producing 35% of GDP. So we're basically in the Middle Ages here, basically peasants. Gold is their biggest export, roughly 70% of exports. They also export some cotton, some zinc, some phosphate, some livestock. I hope you're getting the picture of what kind of country this is. They have a penchant for coups. How many coups have they had in recent years? It's 1966, 1980, 1982, 1983, 1987, twice in 2022. They also had failed coups in 1989, 2015, 2023. Not exactly the most stable place. They actually did have a very famous leader named Thomas Sankara. I was reading about him. I didn't know about him until I was doing the background on this, Marco, who was the 1983 successful coup guy. He got assassinated a couple years later, coup of 1987, but was a really interesting guy. Embarked on a nationwide literacy campaign, land redistribution to peasants, vaccinating Burkina Faso's children, outlawing polygamy and female genital mutilation. Was a really, really interesting guy, and talked about Burkina Faso being the vanguard of the third world, again, assassinated after like 3 or 4 years by his friend in the Burkina Faso military. Amidst all that, Ibrahim Traore is now the dictator. It seems to me that he has none of those classically liberal policies of Thomas Sankara, but he fancies himself a dictator. He's cozying up with Russia. He went to, I forget which country he was going to for an inauguration, but he came with a sidearm strapped and like gloves on, like has a whole like thing for theatrics and things like that. And Margot, you're getting pro videos of this guy on your YouTube algorithm. So I hand it over to you. What have you been watching that this is what you get on YouTube, my friend?
So hopefully we can get Smooth to plug some of them, just to have some of our listeners sample these. So basically, I don't really want to talk about Burkina Faso. It is a large gold producer in the world. Gold prices are shooting up, so good for them. That's drawing a lot of interest. And Traore has kicked out the French. He's kind of cozied up with the Russians, the Wagner group. So there's geopolitical sort of side issue here, but I wouldn't overstate it. No one's going to fight over Burkina Faso and its gold mines. Like, I bet you anything. Geopolitical YouTubers are like all up in arms about that. No, that's not going to happen. To me, what's interesting about it is that basically I think like, I don't know, somewhere trying to watch some NBA highlights, and one of these YouTube shorts pops up, and it's a pro Traore like video. So I click on it because I'm like, what? Burkina Faso? I haven't heard that country in a long time. And it's basically some, chill dude who keeps pronouncing the country's name as Burkina Faso. And he just goes.
I'm not an expert. Maybe that's the right way to pronounce it. I don't actually know.
I don't think so. But like, he goes off about how it's awesome. And I'm like, whatever. I don't understand where this person came from. But sure, going back to watching my Lakers get shredded by the Timberwolves. And then a couple of days later, boom, another one. This time it's a cute girl, young, hip, like it would be one of those videos for like how to put on nice foundation before the makeup goes on. And boom, she's staring at a camera and talking about Burkina Faso and how Traore is awesome. And then I realized, like, wait a minute. This guy is literally like paying people around the world to make these videos. Like, can we just stop for a second and acknowledge that Ibrahim Traore, dude with a sidearm and white gloves, and like, he's actually paying people around the world or some PR agency to create these poorly engineered yet organic videos about how he's an awesome revolutionary leader. And I'm just like, wow, geopolitics has gone, like, no, all I'm thinking about, like, Jacob, you and I are going to become like absolute millionaires. And here's why. Geopolitics has gone like mainstream. Just this guy Traore, he's on our side. He's on our corner. God bless him. In fact, let me tell you something. He has shown perseverance in fighting off the colonial French who wanted his mines. I'm just kidding. He actually hasn't paid me yet, so I can't really do the whole bit. But the point is, it's insane. Like, social media has become a geopolitical battleground. Now, I know a lot of people are going to say, dude, that's always been the case. Like, Russia stole the election. Like, no. This is much more organic, much more low key, much more lowbrow, and it's kind of awesome.
He is the exact same age that I am. So he's younger than you. In some sense, we should view him as a competitor. And maybe, Marco, it shouldn't be you and I talking. Maybe we should get some cute girl putting on her foundation and then looking in the camera and being like, multipolarity and Royal Jordanian Airlines. What is the combination of these things? And why should you listen to Marco Papich and Jacob Shapiro? But so he's younger than you.
Yes.
And I will say, I'll take a little bit of the other side, which is to say, this is obviously Russia is pushing this. Like this has the Kremlin's propaganda fingers all over. And why maybe they're testing something out. I don't know. Like, I don't think that Traore was sitting there and was like, aha, I will use YouTube in order to.
I disagree. I disagree. I think you nailed it. And actually, I noted his age. I looked him up. Yes, he's like 37, right?
He's 37. There you go.
So I noted that, and I was like, no, man, I bet you he's doing this himself. Actually, he may not even, like, this, there is a department, right, in his like communication ministry or something. And he has literally hired the person to do this because he's 37, because he's tech savvy, because he probably spends like 7 hours a day on YouTube. This guy is literally paying people to do his branding and PR. To what end? I'm not really sure, but I for sure hope that he listens to us. I will do a live show out of Burkina Faso. Like, bring it.
Do you know what the capital of Burkina Faso is?
Yes, it's Ouagadougou. Wait.
Wow. Okay.
Like
I wasn't even going to try to pronounce it, but I see that you have it there.
Is that what this is? Wait.
Yeah,
how do you
you got
pronounce
it.
I
don't know how to pronounce it. It's spelled
Ouagadougou.
Ouagadougou. I think it's
Yes.
Ouagadougou. It's got some French stuff in there. He's also
What
got
do you
not an interesting past. He studied geology in university. He was part of an association of Muslim students and a Marxist association when he was
at
in
the same
school.
time, this guy is just hedging Islamists and Marxists. Like he doesn't care. I mean, no,
Well,
this guy.
his
Media
biggest challenge
savvy.
is the jihadists, like Burkina Faso, Niger, all these different countries. I mean, this is like smuggling central, and the jihadists and all these others are moving weapons and drugs and people through all these different things. And the reason that he's in the position that he is, and that you've had coups in all of these different countries, and why they're all so mad at the French, is because nobody could stop this, and they're dealing with massive insecurity. And you're probably going to have a population that is willing to trade, whatever the heck he wants to do wearing gloves with his sidearm if he gives them security. And I don't know if he's going to be able to give them security. This is a tall task. This is not like Bukele, where he can just lock them all up and then start, harvesting, mining Bitcoin with the powers from the volcano. Like Burkina Faso doesn't really have much that it can really go with, and he's going to have to really defeat the jihadists if he's going to survive. So
listen. So what if the gold bugs are right and gold goes to 5,000, right? Like, look, I just want to say right away, President Traore, Marco Papic, I was pretty much the first to notice what you're doing on social media and call it brilliant. When you set up your sovereign wealth fund, you got your CIO right here. Boom, there you go.
I don't think gold going to 5,000 is going to make enough of a difference here. I think you're overstating.
He probably won't. It's actually, look, it's a large country, as you said, size of Florida, lots of people. I think it's like 38 million or something like that. Lots of challenges. This isn't an easy country to run. Actually, what is the population? Let's see here. I don't think I got that right.
23 million?
It is 23, my bad.
Yeah.
I just doubled. Well, you know what? I'm already thinking, and I already took Ghana for my future president. So there you go. I just combined it with Ghana. But anyways, look, the point is, joking aside, I think that it's fascinating. Like I should not, my YouTube algorithm obviously is trying to figure me out, knows I'm a basketball fan and I guess love geopolitics. So it just like targeted me. But I wonder if any other of our listeners were targeted by these random videos of a random president, and to what end, I don't know. But I do know that geopolitics is becoming far more mainstream than just a bunch of nerds, IR nerds who went to Model United Nations in high school.
Maybe one of our listeners will tell us that there's much ado here about nothing, but you're not the first one to notice it. I hate to burst your bubble. Like in just the last month, the Economist had a profile of him. The Council on Foreign Relations had a negative profile. Like most of these things being anti his policies and talking about him as a pro-Russian force, anti-French, anti-the West. That's not the point.
But they didn't talk about social media?
They all, not as much. That you have the social media thing, but I'm just saying that they got in the Economist's algorithm and they got in the CFR's algorithm so that they're focusing on this guy, which there are tons of different places all around the world where you probably have leaders who would love to have a profile in the Economist, even if it's a negative one. They don't, and this guy does. So something is happening where he is
he's winning,
getting on the radar of Western states and of English press. To what end? Like with you, I'm not quite sure, but it's happening. It's interesting that it's happening. So, okay. That is segment number 2. Segment number 3, you wanted to talk about geopolitical quantitative tightening.
Yeah.
I have no idea where you're going with this. Why don't you lead us off?
All right. Well, you know what? So I've been traveling the world over the last 3 weeks. So I did an around the world trip to visit my clients and give some speeches. It started with Hong Kong, Singapore, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Muscat, Riyadh. I'm actually recording this out of Vaduz in Liechtenstein, where I had some great fun with clients and good friends. And it's interesting to me that nobody's really panicking. Americans are kind of panicking about President Trump and the tariffs. The rest of the world is not. They're not happy about it, but I didn't get a sense of, that the rest of the world thinks that the world is collapsing. So that was interesting. I did not get asked about a recession at all.
No,
I got asked about.
It's because we're already in one. Sorry.
Yeah, no, and that's fine. We might be already in one, but it's whatever, sure, whatever, it'll be fine. And maybe that's a sign that it won't be fine, by the way, and that's perfectly fine. I understand that. But what was interesting to me was, first of all, everyone's already kind of comfortable with this world. And I mentioned earlier Saudi Arabia. And I mentioned basically how after the Abqaiq Quraysh attack in 2019, Saudi Arabia realized that it was, it was kind of on its own. And so it had to make the deal with Iran without American participation. And then two things happened over the past week or so. First of all, we have India, Pakistan exchanging fires. We talked about that last podcast. And Vice President J.D. Vance said, very similar to President Trump's comments on the Houthis, he basically said, like, look, America wishes that these two countries would settle their differences peacefully. And we certainly would hope that they do so, but it's not our fight. So you've got JD Vance basically saying, like, look, India and Pakistan, like, God bless you both. We hope that you figure it out. And then President Trump saying, like, well, we made a deal with the Houthis. Like, everyone else, have fun. And so there are two ways to interpret this. One is this hegemonic stability thesis. This is why unipolarity is so good. Charles Kindleberger, famous economic historian, wrote about this in various books. This idea that the hegemon provides, it solves the collective action dilemma of the world by providing global public goods, such as literally the freedom of navigation. So the Houthi example being very important because the US has effectively just announced that it will no longer provide a very expensive global public good, which is free seaborne transportation. Like they will do so for their own ships. And so the consensus view is basically that without hegemonic stability, you have, multipolar instability. There's no more America ensuring that the rest of the world is going to be safe. This is effectively the beginning of the end of the world, as our former colleague and good friend Peter Zion, wrote in his book. But then I have a different way to interpret this, especially when I look at what's happened with Iran and Saudi Arabia making a very stable detente, which has ensured that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict doesn't actually spill over the rest of the Middle East. I mean, yes, Iran and Israel exchanged missile fire, but it hasn't spread to the rest of the Middle East. And in fact, the rest of the Middle East is quite stable. I just visited 3 countries in the Persian Gulf, and they're awesome. There's absolutely nothing. No, I mean, there's absolutely nothing going on there that's wrong. It would be like saying West Germany and Denmark are unstable because the Iron Curtain is next door during the Cold War. Well, that wasn't the case. Yes, Iron Curtain, countries behind it were in a bad shape, but West Germany was freaking awesome. So what I'm saying is that Iran and Saudi Arabia actually came to an agreement. They had to sit down like adults. They had to talk. They had to delineate their interests, and they had to resolve their differences in a very frosty way. No one's saying there's peace between them. What I'm getting at is this. Yes, you can view American hegemony and provision of all these public goods as very, very stable. But at some point, it can also become like quantitative easing, QE. And many people in finance know that with a central bank flooded the economy with effectively cheap money, with QE, it saved us from the great financial crisis and its aftermath. Absolutely. I'm definitely not one of those people who shake their little fist and angrily, because I was short for the next 4 years and got my face ripped off. But at the same time, we all know that it created distortions in the economy. So in other words, when a hegemon provides stability, it does so in a way that distorts reality. And often countries and regions and entire geographies become addicted to that provision of, cheap geopolitical stability. You have vassal states that effectively act with impunity because they are supported by the hegemon. You have rivals that feel slighted, that feel normatively and ideologically opposed in an existential way, where they cannot come to an agreement. And that creates instability. And so the withdrawal of American support or American oversight or American geopolitical QE, so that, in financial terms would be quantitative tightening, which, by the way, the Fed has been doing for several years, and everybody thought it would end humanity. It hasn't at all. Similarly, the United States of America withdrawing its overarching support may not create instability. In fact, it may create stability because countries have to act with each other like adults. They no longer, countries that are American allies like Israel or Ukraine or Taiwan may not have the blank check that they once had, which is not a bad thing. It may force them to actually consider their security and threat environment and say, look, we don't have America at our back all the time, so we should actually sit down with our neighbors, with our rivals, and create a geopolitical equilibrium that is effectively, more durable. They can withstand a Donald Trump. They can withstand in the future a President AOC. And so that's kind of my lesson over the last couple of weeks that's gotten me thinking that maybe we overstate how beneficial hegemonic stability is.
Yeah, I think I would push back or caveat in two ways. I think you're right for strong and developed powers, because now stable balances of power have to emerge rather than a hegemon being responsible for everything else and people pushing against the hegemon and things like that. But as you can see in places like Burkina Faso or in Congo or with India and Pakistan, like places on the periphery, those places get worse because those places become the proxy wars that the Olympians use to fight their battles, because they're not going to fight their battles, so sort of to your point, with real wars. Russia tried to do that, and look where Russia is right now. Nobody else is going to do that, China included with Taiwan, in my opinion. But it's in those like forgotten places of the world that nobody really cares about. I think that actually the lack of hegemonic power, and it's not even hegemonic power, the lack of international order, like those are the places that I think it shows up the most. And the second is, I think you're right for the snapshot in history where countries are all trying to take advantage of the multipolar system. But previous eras of multipolarity eventually go to the point where you have countries that get strong enough in their own backyards where they think they can be the global hegemon, or they have an imperative, say like Japan in the early 1900s, to become a hegemon because otherwise they can't continue to grow or can't continue to do the things that geopolitics is forcing them to do. So you have this period, I think you're right, of like stable dynamism where you have balancing against each other. But if you get to the point where, say, and we're not there, people have been calling this about China, for example, for decades. The moment where China really can't feed itself or can't power itself, and it has to go out and get those things from other places, and it needs, a blue water navy to do that. It needs to fight the Americans or the Russians or anybody else wherever they are in order to secure access to those resources, and they think that they're strong enough to do it. Well, suddenly you can get sort of global war. So the caveat there is, I think you're right in the short term. I just think that if you go too far in that direction and you get countries that begin to drink the Kool-Aid and believe that they are themselves regional hegemons, then you get the possibility of some of these global conflicts. And I think the hardest thing for countries in navigating the multipolar era will be 20 years from now that we're not in World War III. Because I think if things go unchecked, and if you get the US on one side, and China on one side, and Europe, and all of these mutually exclusive interests, and countries that think they are strong enough or deserve different things, like then you can get into the situation that we were in the early 1900s and mid 1900s. But I think broadly speaking, like that's the reason I am so like optimistic from an investment perspective over the next 10 to 15 years. This should be a time of booming, not of, to your point, like constraint.
Well, I mean, but let's put ourselves back in 1914. I may have done this on the podcast before, so stop me if I have. But
I don't think you have. I don't remember this.
Okay, so let's say the Gavrilo Princip. Shout out to my people, Serbs, original terrorists since 1914. Started World War I, right? Shot the crown prince of basically Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo, and that launches World War I. Now, let's create a scenario, a game, where that happens, but every great power is a nuclear power. Mm-hmm. So Serbia is not a great power, so no nukes for Serbia, but Austria-Hungary is. They have nukes. Russia has nukes. German Empire has nukes.
The France Ottomans have nukes.
Let's say no.
Oh, okay, that's throwing some shade at the Ottomans, but okay, fine.
Let's throw some shade.
They had the Janissaries. They were ahead of most people, but fine. No nukes for the Turks.
Yeah,
well appointed. Turkey, please remember that I was sticking up for you in this conversation. You can have Burkina Faso to our listeners in Istanbul and Ankara. Wicked.
Yeah, well, I mean, Janissaries were mostly Serbs and Albanians, first of all, but let's not forget that. Also, Also, United Kingdom has nukes. But here's what
Of
happens
course.
in that scenario. I think in that scenario, what happens is Austria-Hungary attacks Serbia, as they did. They get their asses kicked, which happened in real life. They're shockingly lose. Then they invade Serbia again, and as in real life, they get their asses kicked. So it was only on the third attempt that the Austrians actually won, and it was because the Germans came along this third time. And so I think what happens in the world if everybody has nukes is that basically Austria-Hungary versus Serbia becomes a Russia versus Ukraine conflict. United Kingdom, France, and Russia support Serbia with weapons, and Germany supports Austria-Hungary with weapons. And it's basically, like these two blocks fighting a proxy war, such as the Korean War, such as Vietnam War to an extent, and ultimately what's happening right now. In other words, we don't get to World War I. We get to an Austria-Hungary versus Serbia conflict over effectively Bosnia-Herzegovina, which Austrians lose.
Yeah, and to your point, I mean, and maybe not a lot of people even die because both sides at this point also have drones and artificial intelligence, and it's just a battle of who has the best drones and robots and things like that, and then whoever wins gets to conquer the social media, blah 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 of that country, and you go forward. But
and obviously, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, the devil's advocate is. At the time when World War I broke out, like the prevailing conventional theory was that economies were so interconnected that no country would choose to go to war because it would be catastrophic for their economies and therefore they wouldn't. I think we've already, that was proven wrong. Like, countries were willing to do that. I think we've seen that with the trade war now. The extent to which the trade war has already gone shows you that economic interconnectedness does not stop countries when they think their geopolitical interests are at stake. The way I'm going to push back against you, though, is that the notion that nukes will prevent great power conflict from breaking out feels a little bit to me like, oh, economic interconnectedness will obviously prevent countries from going to war with each other because it would destroy them. Like, it has worked that way thus far, but I don't know. I'm not so sanguine that is always going to be the case.
Well, look, there's two ways to look at this, Jacob. Number one is that I'm right. Because people, wait, just let me.
I know, it was just funny the way you phrased it. There are two ways to look at this. First of all, I'm right.
First of all, I'm right. Second of all, you're wrong. No, that would be the same thing. No, first of all, I'm right. And the reason I would be right is because it's much easier for a mere pleb to understand being incinerated by a thermonuclear device than like how the web of interconnected finance and economy prevents conflict. In other words, like there's a real challenge in accepting nuclear war, even amongst the dumbest of us, right? So that would be the first. The second way to think about it is that you are correct. I'll be wrong. There'll be thermonuclear war, and then we'll all die. But I'm going to stick to my view because, and I'll tell you why. If there is a thermonuclear war, and you're correct, the entire listening base of Geopolitical Cousins will for a split second think that Marko Papić is a moron. And that will be the last thought they have as they're incinerated. And I'm just comfortable with that view. I'm comfortable with being wrong for 3 seconds. So I'm going to say that I will be correct.
The best 3 seconds of my life. Well, I don't want to get too grim and too dystopian here, but have you read Mustafa Suleyman's book, The Coming Wave, Technology, Power, 21st Century's Greatest Dilemma? It's about like the sort of artificial intelligence, and there's a chapter about the intersection with biotechnology where the point that like some kid in his garage with CRISPR could like create a virus that could go after a particular family or a particular ethnicity.
Ethnic group,
you can. So like you're probably right. Like in the outlier, thermonuclear war, like probably not going to happen. The nuclear powers aren't going to do battle against each other. Maybe Austria-Hungary nukes Serbia in your metaphor or something like that, but nobody's going to nuke Austria-Hungary because then Austria-Hungary is going to nuke them. But could you have some radical in Austria-Hungary who is like, okay, I have now created a weapon that will wipe out the Serbians. And then, like, what's going to happen next? Is somebody going to create a virus that tries to wipe out the leaders of Austro-Hungary or the Austro-Hungarians themselves? Like, I think it starts to take us down these paths where maybe things get really dark and really twisty. So maybe it's not nukes that we should be worried about. Maybe there are other ways that conflict and other weapons that make that conflict less
that's
savory.
fair. That's very dark, very fair. I think, to me, thus far, look, I mean, the problem with nukes is that 99 out of 100 times Marco may be right, but the one time he's wrong, I mean, obviously it will be very bad. And yet, here we are. India and Pakistan have a clear security dilemma between them. Pakistan used to be equivalent to India in terms of military strength in the past. That hasn't been the case for like 50, 60 years. I mean, I don't even know. And yet there's a balance of power. And yet there's this very choreographed, conflict every time. Like nuclear weapons, clearly, I think clearly, like if the South Asia subcontinent didn't have nuclear weapons, I mean, don't you think that India, given its massively overwhelming now advantage over the last at least 50 years, would have at some point just said, like, what are we doing here? Like, these guys can't fight us.
No, I think you're actually making my point for me, which is I think neither India nor Pakistan believes it can conquer the other. And that the nukes are there, to your point, as a defensive failsafe. But we have not reached a point where either side can confidently say to itself that we can conquer them and our government can survive the political consequences or the pain that would come from doing this. Like, sure, there's 1 billion Indians and there's 300 million Pakistanis. How many Indians would have to die in a conventional war to, number one, conquer Pakistan and then to actually govern it? Like, it's just not realistic. But you could get to a scenario. I don't think China's going to do this, but let me say that now, right? This is absolutely fantastical. But let's say the United States continues to decline. We don't make ships anymore. We only have 200 ships in the Navy. We're having measles outbreaks everywhere. China has become a true blue water Navy. It's everything else. And they decide, you know what? We're going to sail up the Mississippi and take the United States. Like, we think we can do this and we're tired of this Western power, whatever. And it does the United States at that moment say, oh, the only thing we have is nukes. Like, existentially, we have to survive. We fire the nukes back. Like, it has to be some type of scenario where a great power thinks it can off another great power, and then they have to resort to nukes as like a last sort of ditch effort thing.
But I think you're creating a straw man and way too much of a high threshold, because, India and Pakistan could have a conventional war where a lot of people die, but over a limited, because I just don't see what would be the point of India conquering Pakistan, for what end to what end. I don't think they would ever contemplate that. But Kashmir, like taking all of it, like that is a reasonable goal for a country to decide to start a conventional war over. And even that conflict has been prevented. And by the way, India has genuinely an overwhelming conventional military superiority. So clearly the reason it hasn't decided to do that is because of the Pakistani nuclear deterrent. So even a smaller conflict has been prevented.
Or because it doesn't have the imperative to do it and the capability to do it. You're right that India is a bad example from that point of view. The good example is the one I brought up earlier, which is early 1900s Japan, which is to continue to survive and to grow. Japan was forced to become imperialistic and dominant and militarily aggressive. And so they had to take the East Indies. They had to take parts of China. They had to take parts of Russia. They had to continue to expand until they had enough control to actually maintain their economy the way that was going to be. So you'd have to have a country with that kind of imperative that says, no, I will go after the great powers, because if I don't, then the United States can just cut off my oil and I'm done in 6 months. Or, China can just say something and then I'm done. So
I think that's a very good example. That's how multipolarity fails. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's why China's maybe the scariest of all the countries, because China has echoes of that. Like, China in its vast history usually can do things itself. It's the middle kingdom. It looks inwards. It thinks everybody else is barbarians. But if you get to the point where China does truly have to look outward and has to secure its interests by being a global hegemon, and if it starts to believe that it can do that or must do that, like then multipolarity starts to shift into a sort of darker place.
And there are two, we should probably dedicate a whole hour to China at some point, but I think there's two views on this, including in China, including with mainland China strategists and scholars and academics. And one is that, no, China is genuinely different civilization. And then there's the other view which says, no, since the end of the last basically dynasty and the collapse of the Sun Yat-sen temporary regime, China has effectively adopted the operating software from, Europe of a nation state, and that does mean that they will eventually think like Japan did, like the United States does, thinking in terms of spheres of influence, regional hegemony, global hegemony, and so on. And so, I guess, given your example, the world better hope that the Chinese do think they're a different civilization, that they won't fall down the same path as every other regional and global hegemon.
I think they do, and I think they are. But the United States once thought that it was too. And
Japan did too. To your point, of all the countries that decided to wholeheartedly just adopt the operating system of European nation state, I think Japan is a great example. And so studying that early 20th century Japan and why it embarked on the decisions it did, I think is very interesting. Of course, at the time, imperialism was on mode, so like, Japanese models at the time, their example were the expanding German Empire talking about its place in the sun, the Russian Empire next door, Europeans. And so I can see how they thought that they were behind on imperialism. But nonetheless, I think your point is
imperialism's
valid.
back, baby. We've got pictures of William McKinley in the White House. Remember, like it's back.
Yes.
It's here to stay. All right, I got to go pick up my kid. That was a good 55 minutes. We'll get back to y'all next week.